The day I found out they sold my husband's 1967 Mustang, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stopped breathing for a second. It was a midnight blue fastback. The kind of car that makes grown men turn their heads at red lights. The kind of engine that didn't just start, it roared. But to me it wasn't horsepower. It was Robert. My husband of 43 years. That Mustang was the last thing he drove before cancer hollowed him out. The last thing he polished with his own hands. The last thing he asked me to protect. Mary, he told me from his hospital bed. Fingers weak but eyes steady. Don't let anyone touch my car. That's ours. And I promised him. I kept that promise through the funeral. Through the sympathy casseroles. Through the silence of an empty house that felt too big without his boots by the door. Then my son Daniel said, "Mom, you shouldn't be alone. Move in with us." It sounded loving. It sounded responsible. It sounded like family. So I packed up 40 years of marriage into boxes and left the house Robert and I built together. I brought only what mattered. Photo albums, a few personal things, and the Mustang. Daniel assured me it would stay in his garage. "It'll be safe here," he said. Safe. For 6 months, I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Grief makes strange rules. Sometimes even love hurts too much to visit. But one afternoon, something in me needed to sit in that driver's seat again. Needed to breathe in the leather. Needed to feel close to him. "Daniel," I said casually, "can you open the garage? I want to see the Mustang." Silence. The kind that doesn't belong in a loving home. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, suddenly found intense interest in wiping down the counter. Again. Daniel swallowed. "Mommed about that." My heart dropped before he even said it. "We sold it." Just like that. Sold. Like it was an old treadmill. Like it was patio furniture. Like it wasn't the last living memory of my husband. I stared at him. Waiting for a punchline. Waiting for a "just kidding." Waiting for some explanation that didn't feel like betrayal. "It was just sitting there," he continued, avoiding my eyes. "Classic car prices are high right now." It made sense. Jessica finally joined in, arms folded. "And honestly, Mary, we needed the extra space. Plus the money helped with the kitchen remodel." The kitchen remodel. I looked slowly toward the gleaming marble countertops. White. Cold. Expensive. "How much?" I asked. $85,000, Daniel said quietly. $85,000. For the last thing my husband ever asked me to protect. "And the money?" My voice was steady now. Too steady. "It went into our joint account," Jessica answered quickly. "It benefits the household. You live here too." "You live here too." Like I was a tenant. Like I should be grateful. I nodded once. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't collapse like they expected me to. But something inside me shifted permanently. Because in that moment, I realized something very important. They didn't think I had power. They thought I was old. Dependent. Clueless about money. They thought selling that Mustang wouldn't have consequences. They thought I had nowhere else to go. What they didn't know was this. Robert wasn't just good with engines. He was brilliant with investments. And while they were busy picking out backsplash tile, I still had access to accounts they'd never even heard of. They took the Mustang. But they just made the biggest financial mistake of their lives. Because the one thing Jessica loves more than her new kitchen is the white Range Rover parked in that driveway. And unlike them, I don't need permission to make decisions. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in that guest bedroom, not my room, never my room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in lazy circles, listening to the faint hum of their dishwasher downstairs. The same dishwasher that had probably been paid for with my husband's Mustang. Every time it clicked or shifted cycles, it felt like a reminder. They sold him. That's what it felt like. Not just the car. Him. Robert spent years restoring that Mustang piece by piece. I remember one winter when money was tight. Daniel was in college. Tuition was suffocating us. And someone offered Robert a strong cash deal for the car. A very strong deal. He could have sold it and wiped out a big chunk of debt. He refused. "It's not for sale," he said calmly. "But we could use the money," I had argued gently. He smiled at me and replied, "Some things aren't about money." And now our own son had sold it for Countertops. I turned on my side and let one tear slip into the pillow. Just one. Because grief is allowed. But humiliation? That burns different. The next morning at breakfast, Jessica was glowing. Actually glowing. She had her coffee in one of those oversized beige mugs with blessed, written in gold cursive across it. "Isn't the kitchen so much brighter now?" she said, running her manicured hand across the marble like she'd personally discovered stone. Daniel didn't look at me. I watched him closely. The same boy who once cried because a neighbor kid broke his bicycle. The same boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of that Mustang while Robert drove us home from summer cookouts. He couldn't meet my eyes. That told me everything. Jessica, on the other hand, had no shame. "We really made the right decision selling that car," she continued casually. "It was just sitting there collecting dust." Collecting dust. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap. "That car wasn't collecting dust," I said quietly. "It was holding memories." She gave a tight smile. "Well, memories don't pay property taxes." There it was. The truth. To her, everything had a price tag. And suddenly something clicked in my mind. If she valued things by numbers, then numbers would be my language. After breakfast, Daniel left for work. Jessica took her Range Rover to Pilates. The house went quiet. I walked slowly to my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened an app they had never seen me use before. My investment portfolio. Robert had insisted I learn everything years ago. "If something ever happens to me," he used to say, "I don't want you depending on anyone." He'd built a portfolio that most people would never imagine belonged to a retired couple who clipped coupons and drove a 20-year-old sedan for errands. Energy stocks. Real estate trusts. Tech investments from early days. When Robert passed, I inherited everything seamlessly. And over the last 5 years, I hadn't just let it sit. I grew it. Carefully. Quietly. Intelligently. While they thought I was surviving off Social Security and a teacher's pension, I scrolled through the numbers calmly. Liquid assets alone could buy this house outright. Twice. They thought they took something from me. They had no idea what I still owned. But revenge isn't about anger. It's about precision. Jessica loved her Range Rover like it was a trophy. White exterior. Red leather interior. Custom rims. She washed it every Saturday morning like it was royalty. I remembered a conversation from months ago. She had bragged at dinner to her friends about leveraging the equity and smart financing. That meant one thing. That vehicle wasn't fully paid off. Which meant there was a loan. Which meant there were obligations. And obligations can become pressure points. I didn't move impulsively. I called my lawyer instead. A calm, collected man named Thomas Green who had handled Robert's estate years ago. "Mary," he said warmly when he answered. "What can I help you with?" "I need to understand something," I replied evenly. "If someone sells property that wasn't legally theirs, and deposits the money into a shared account, what are the consequences?" Silence on the other end. Then his tone sharpened. "Did someone sell something of yours?" "Yes." "What documentation do you have?" "Title was in my name." Another pause. "Mary," he said slowly, "that's unauthorized sale of personal property. Depending on how it was done, it could carry civil liability. Possibly more." I closed my eyes briefly. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. Legally, they had crossed a line. "I'm not looking to destroy my son," I said quietly. "But I need leverage." Thomas understood immediately. "Let me review some options," he replied. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Power. Not loud power. Not angry power. Strategic power. They thought they made a smart financial move. They thought I would cry, adjust, and move on. But they forgot something important. I am the woman who survived 43 years of marriage, raised 3 children, managed a household on 1 income, and buried the love of my life without collapsing. I don't break. I adapt. And as I stood at the window watching Jessica's precious Range Rover pull back into the driveway, sunlight gleaming off its polished hood, I realized something almost poetic. They sold the last thing my husband loved. Now I was about to teach them what it feels like to lose something they can't imagine living without. And I hadn't even started yet. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't screaming in kitchens or slamming doors. It's paperwork. It's patience. It's timing. The morning after I spoke to my lawyer, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I was upset. That part had cooled into something steadier. But because clarity had arrived. And clarity is powerful. I made my coffee the way Robert used to. Strong, no sugar, just a splash of cream. I sat at the kitchen island, the very one paid for with his Mustang, and opened my laptop. For years, Daniel had assumed I didn't understand technology. He'd set up my phone like I was helpless. Jessica once explained online banking to me in a tone usually reserved for toddlers. They had no idea I'd been managing diversified investment accounts since before Jessica knew what a 401k was. I logged into the vehicle registry portal. The Mustang title had been in my name only. Robert made sure of that years ago after a close friend went through a messy inheritance situation. Keep assets clean, he always said. Clarity prevents chaos. Clarity. The sale had been processed digitally, which meant signatures, which meant documentation. And there it was. My electronic signature. Forged. Not even well. They had tried to mimic my cursive, but the loops were tighter. Slightly slanted wrong. My heart didn't race. It went still. They hadn't just sold it. They falsified my authorization. I closed the laptop gently. This was no longer emotional betrayal. This was legal exposure. Around 10 a.m., Jessica walked in from her morning yoga class, glowing and energized, tossing her keys onto the marble counter like she owned the world. "Morning, Mary," she chirped. Mary. Not Mom. Never Mom unless company was present. "Morning," I replied evenly. She opened the refrigerator and grabbed almond milk. "Daniel and I were talking last night," she said casually. "We think it might be best if you downsize your things a little. The guest room closet is getting tight." Downsize? In the house my husband's car remodeled. I looked at her carefully. "Jessica," I said softly. "Do you know how much that Mustang was worth on the collector's market?" She shrugged. Whatever someone was willing to pay. It was insured for $140,000. That made her freeze. Not emotionally. Financially. "That can't be right," she said quickly. "It is." Silence filled the kitchen. I could see the math running behind her eyes. They had sold it for $85,000. That meant either they were careless, or they were cheated. Neither option looked good. Daniel walked in just then, tie half done, sensing tension immediately. "What's going on?" I turned to him calmly. "Daniel, did you know the Mustang was insured for $140,000? His face drained of color. Jessica looked at him sharply. "You said 85 was a good deal." Daniel stammered. That was what the buyer offered. Classic car market fluctuates." "Yes," I said gently. "It does. Which is why serious collectors get independent appraisals." The room felt smaller suddenly. Not because I raised my voice, but because I raised awareness. I stood slowly. "I also noticed something else," I added. "My signature was required for the transfer." Jessica's breathing changed. Daniel's eyes flickered. "I don't recall signing anything." That's when the air shifted completely. Panic. Not loud, but present. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Mom, it was just paperwork. The guy needed it fast. You weren't feeling well that week, So you what?" I asked quietly. Silence. Jessica stepped in defensively. "This is ridiculous. We did what we thought was best for everyone." "For everyone?" I repeated. "Yes. You live here. We upgraded the home. It benefits you too." I smiled. And that smile unsettled them more than anger ever could. "Interesting," I said calmly. "Because legally, that sale did not benefit me at all." Daniel swallowed hard. "Mom, are you threatening us?" "Threatening?" The word hung there. "No. Irraplia smoothly. I'm clarifying." Then I picked up my purse. "I have lunch plans." With that, I walked out the front door. Not rushed. Not shaken. Measured. Because the next step wasn't confrontation. It was positioning. I met Thomas at a quiet downtown restaurant. White tablecloths. No noise. No drama. He had already reviewed the digital transfer. Mary, he said carefully, this is fraud. Hearing the words spoken aloud changed everything. Fraud. Not misunderstanding. Not miscommunication. Fraud. You have grounds for civil action, he continued. You could demand the full market difference. Possibly more in damages. I stirred my iced tea thoughtfully. And if I don't want to destroy my son? Thomas leaned back. Then you use this as leverage. Leverage. The word felt right. Because I didn't want prison sentences. I wanted balance. I wanted them to understand that I was not dependent. Not powerless. Not disposable. That evening, when I returned home, Jessica's Range Rover sat gleaming in the driveway like a symbol of arrogance. I stood beside it for a moment, ran my fingers along the polished hood, and I noticed something interesting. The registration sticker. Expiring soon. Leased. Not owned. And leases come with very specific terms. Very strict financial conditions. Especially when household income changes. I smiled faintly. They had assumed I needed them. They never considered what would happen if I decided they needed me instead. And tomorrow, I was going to make the first move. The next morning, I woke up with a calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't anger. It was control. There is something deeply empowering about knowing the truth, especially when the people around you think you don't. I made my coffee slowly, listening to the house breathe around me. Jessica was upstairs getting ready for the day, humming to herself as if nothing had shifted. Daniel was in the shower. They believed yesterday had been uncomfortable but survivable. They assumed I would cool down, adjust, and eventually stop mentioning the Mustang. They thought the tension would fade. What they didn't understand was that I had already moved 3 steps ahead. After breakfast, Daniel approached me carefully, his tone softer than usual. He attempted what I recognized immediately as damage control. He explained that the buyer had connections, that the offer had been time-sensitive, that paperwork sometimes needed to move quickly in collector circles. It was a story stitched together with half-truths and panic. I listened without interrupting, watching him carefully. The more he spoke, the more I realized something critical. He hadn't expected me to verify anything. He had counted on my ignorance. When he finished, I simply nodded and told him I understood that mistakes happen when people rush decisions. The relief on his face was almost painful to witness. He mistook my composure for forgiveness. Later that afternoon, when Jessica left for lunch with friends, I made my first strategic move. I called my financial advisor. Not because I needed money, but because I needed positioning. You see, when I moved into Daniel's home, I had agreed, at his suggestion, to contribute to household expenses. It sounded reasonable at the time. A small monthly transfer to help with utilities and groceries. It was generous, and frankly unnecessary, but I agreed because I wanted to feel like I wasn't a burden. What they didn't know was that those transfers weren't small. They were covering nearly 30% of their mortgage payment. Quietly. Consistently. Without applause. I instructed my advisor to halt the automatic transfer effective immediately. No warning. No annoncement. Just stop. Financial strain rarely begins with explosions. It begins with small imbalances. A missed expectation. A payment that doesn't arrive. A budget that tightens unexpectedly. Jessica's Range Rover lease required stable reported income and specific debt-to-income ratios. I knew that because I had reviewed the paperwork months ago when she proudly left it on the counter. She had assumed I wouldn't understand what I was reading. But I did. That vehicle wasn't owned. It was financed on confidence. And confidence can crumble when numbers shift. 2 weeks passed. The first crack appeared subtly. I overheard Daniel on the phone in his office, voice low and tense. Something about temporary cash flow disruption. Something about unexpected budget changes. Jessica grew shorter in tone, snapping at minor things. The grocery trips became more selective. I noticed her studying the online banking app at the kitchen island, brow furrowed. She mentioned inflation twice in one evening, as if trying to find an external villain for an internal problem. They still hadn't asked me about the stop transfer. That told me something important. They didn't want to acknowledge how dependent they had become on what they considered my small contribution. Then came the second move. I had Thomas draft a formal letter. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but a demand for accounting. It was professionally worded, calm, and devastatingly precise. It requested documentation regarding the Mustang sale, buyer information, transaction breakdown, and distribution of funds. It referenced the discrepancy between insured value and sale price. It did not accuse. It simply inquired. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Certified mail. Jessica signed for it. I watched from the living room as she opened the envelope, her posture shifting line by line. Daniel came home early that day. They argued behind closed doors for over an hour. Not about me. Not yet. About the money. About the undervaluation. About the forged signature. I heard Daniel say, "I didn't think she would look into it." That sentence alone confirmed everything I needed to know. That night at dinner, the atmosphere had changed. Jessica avoided eye contact entirely. Daniel attempted a tone of cautious diplomacy. He told me they might need to revisit some financial planning decisions. I nodded sympathetically and told them financial stability requires transparency. I mentioned that Robert always believed in clean documentation. The irony was thick enough to taste. Then Jessica made a mistake. She said, "We wouldn't even be in this position if that car hadn't been such an emotional burden." An emotional burden. I placed my fork down gently. "That car," I said calmly, "was never the burden." Silence followed. The weight of unspoken truth pressed against the room. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before in Jessica's eyes. Fear. Not of me yelling. Not of family conflict. Fear of consequences. Because they were starting to realize something essential. They hadn't sold an old woman's sentimental property. They had interfered with a woman who understood contracts, assets, leverage, and timing. And the Range Rover payment was due in 8 days. By the time the Range Rover payment was due, the house felt different. Not louder. Not explosive. Just tense like air before a storm. Financial stress has a particular sound to it. Quiet calculator taps on phone screens, hushed arguments behind closed doors, doors shutting a little harder than necessary. I didn't have to ask questions. I simply observed. Daniel came home earlier than usual that Friday, his tie loosened, face drawn tight with something he was trying to hide. Jessica was already at the kitchen island, laptop open, bank app glowing against the marble they had once admired so proudly. I was sitting in the living room with a book, not reading a single word, just listening. "I told you the numbers would be tight this month," Jessica whispered sharply. "I didn't think Mom would just stop the transfer without saying anything," Daniel shot back. So there it was. Finally spoken. My name. Not Mary. Not your mother. Mom. Jessica's voice lowered even more. "Well, she did. And now we're short." Short. The word lingered in the air like a diagnosis. I stood slowly and walked into the kitchen, calm and composed. "Is everything all right?" I asked gently. The way they jumped almost made me feel sorry for them. Daniel tried to recover first. "Yeah, just juggling some bills." "Finances require planning," I replied evenly. Robert used to say if your stability depends on someone else's money, then you don't actually own your lifestyle. Jessica stiffened. That sentence landed exactly where it needed to. She closed her laptop a little too quickly. "We're fine," she insisted, though her voice betrayed her. I nodded and poured myself a glass of water. "Good. I wouldn't want you feeling any financial pressure. It can make people do desperate things." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew. They both knew. The letter from Thomas had not gone away. In fact, the second certified envelope had arrived that morning. A formal notice requesting a response within 10 business days regarding the undervalued sale, an unauthorized signature. Not a lawsuit. Yet. But close enough to feel real. That weekend, I noticed something else. Jessica didn't wash the Range Rover on Saturday. It sat in the driveway untouched. For months, that vehicle had been polished like a crown jewel. Now it looked almost neglected. Stress changes priorities. On Monday afternoon, the finance company called. I know because I heard the tone in Jessica's voice when she answered. Polite at first. Defensive second. Tight by the end. Yes, we're aware, she said. It's just a temporary liquidity issue. Temporary liquidity issue. That's corporate language for we don't have the money. When she hung up, Daniel was pacing. We can move money from savings, he suggested. Jessica shook her head sharply. That's already covering the credit card balance from the remodel. Silence. The remodel. Funded by $85,000 that legally belonged to me. I chose that moment to enter the room again. Everything all right? I asked softly. Daniel exhaled. Mom, why did you stop your contribution? It wasn't accusatory. It was pleading. I looked at him carefully, giving the answer the dignity it deserved. Because I realized I was funding a lifestyle I wasn't respected in. Jessica's eyes flashed. That's not fair. No, I agreed calmly. What wasn't fair was selling my property without my consent and forging my name. The word forging made the room colder. Daniel rubbed his temples. We didn't mean for it to escalate like this. But it did, I replied. Jessica's voice cracked slightly. Are you trying to punish us? I held her gaze steadily. No. I'm trying to correct a power imbalance. That was the truth. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. This was restoration. They had assumed I was dependent. They had treated my grief like inconvenience. They had converted my husband's legacy into countertops and lease payments. And now, for the first time, they were confronting the reality that I was not financially fragile. That evening, Daniel knocked on my bedroom door. He hadn't done that in years. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I gestured for him to sit. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. I messed up, he admitted. I thought you wouldn't care as much as Dad did. I thought you'd move on. I studied his face. The same boy who once asked his father to teach him how to drive that Mustang in an empty parking lot. It wasn't about the car, I said gently. It was about respect. He nodded slowly. And now, he asked. Now, I replied, we're going to fix it properly. The Range Rover payment was now 5 days late. Late payments affect credit scores. Credit scores affect refinancing. Refinancing affects mortgage rates. And when mortgages tighten, households tremble. Jessica didn't understand yet that I wasn't just applying pressure. I was recalibrating control. And tomorrow morning, Thomas was sending the third document. This one wouldn't request information. It would offer options. Because there are 2 ways to settle a financial violation. In court. Or privately. And if they wanted to keep that Range Rover in the driveway, they were about to learn exactly what it would cost them. The third letter arrived on a gray Wednesday morning, and this time, I did not wait for them to open it. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the mail truck passed, and I calmly stood up, walked to the door, and signed for the envelope myself. I placed it neatly on the marble counter, the same counter that had once felt like betrayal, and called Daniel and Jessica into the room. My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Authority does not shout. They came down together, already tense. The Range Rover payment was now officially late. The finance company had added penalties. Their savings had thinned more than they anticipated. Stress had begun carving lines into both of their faces. Jessica no longer hummed in the mornings. I slid the envelope toward them. This is from my attorney, I said calmly. I suggest you read it carefully. Daniel opened it with unsteady hands while Jessica leaned in. As their eyes scanned the page, the color drained from their faces. It was a formal notice of intent to pursue civil recovery for unauthorized sale of property, undervaluation damages, and signature fraud. It outlined potential financial liability, well beyond the $85,000 they had received. Once legal fees and assessed damages were calculated, the figure was significantly higher. Jessica's lips parted slightly. This is insane. No, irraplia sufli. It's math. Daniel swallowed hard. Mom, are you really going to sue us? I folded my hands on the table. I gave you both time to acknowledge what happened. Instead, I heard excuses. I heard justification. I heard that my husband's legacy was an inconvenience. Silence pressed against the room. Jessica finally snapped, her composure cracking. We were trying to build something. Improve the house. Make things better. With my asset, I corrected gently. Daniel's voice broke. What do you want? There it was. The question. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Vulnerable. I looked at my son for a long moment. This wasn't about destroying him. It never was. It was about balance. About understanding that actions carry weight. That respect is not optional just because someone grows older. I want accountability, I said evenly. And I want security. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. Security. Yes. I uprooted my life to move here. I trusted you. That trust was violated. So here are the options. I turned the letter around and tapped the second page. My attorney is prepared to file in court. If that happens, this becomes public record. It will affect your credit, your professional standing, and quite possibly your mortgage. Jessica inhaled sharply. Or, I continued calmly, we resolve this privately. Daniel leaned forward. How? I will not pursue litigation, I said. In exchange, the following will happen. First, you will legally refinance this home and place my name on the deed as equal co-owner. Second, you will repay the difference between the sale price and insured value over time, documented and notarized. Third, I regain full control over any financial contribution I choose to make. It will no longer be assumed. Jessica stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. That's manipulation, she said quietly. No. Iraplia. That's leverage. Daniel ran both hands through his hair. And if we don't agree? Then we let the court decide. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since the Mustang was sold, I saw something shift entirely in Jessica's expression. Not anger. Not superiority. Recognition. She finally understood that I was not the dependent elderly woman she had categorized me as. I was an asset holder. A legal owner. A woman who knew contracts. The Range Rover payment reminder buzzed on her phone at that exact moment. The timing felt almost poetic. Jessica looked down at the notification, then back at me. You'd really take everything that far? She asked. I already lost the one thing that mattered most to me, I said quietly. I have nothing left to fear. That statement landed heavily. Daniel looked at the letter again, then at Jessica. Their entire lifestyle sat delicately balanced on reputation and credit stability. A lawsuit would ripple through everything. Daniel's firm, Jessica's social circle, their mortgage lender, their lease agreements. Jessica finally exhaled. If we agree, she said carefully. This ends? It resets, I corrected. Daniel nodded slowly. We need time to think. You have 48 hours, I replied calmly. After that, my attorney proceeds. I stood and walked back to my room without another word. That night, I heard them arguing again. But it wasn't explosive. It was desperate. Numbers were discussed. Options weighed. Pride swallowed. The next evening, Daniel knocked on my door once more. This time, Jessica stood beside him. We'll agree, Daniel said quietly. Jessica didn't speak, but her silence said enough. I studied them both carefully. Good, I replied. Then tomorrow we begin paperwork. As they walked away, I felt something shift inside me. Not victory. Balance. They had taken my husband's Mustang believing I was powerless. Now my name would be on the deed to the very house they thought I was lucky to live in. And the Range Rover? It was still sitting in the driveway. But it no longer symbolized control. Because control had just changed hands. And this was only the beginning of what accountability truly feels like. The day my name was officially added to the deed, the air inside that house changed in a way no one could ignore. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices or slammed doors. It was subtler than that. Ownership carries weight. It shifts posture. It alters tone. It changes who feels secure and who feels watched. When we sat in the attorney's office signing the updated documents, I noticed Jessica's hands tremble slightly as she initialed each page. Daniel avoided looking at either of us. And when the final signature was complete, and the notarized copies were handed across the desk, I felt something settle in my chest. Not revenge, not satisfaction, but stability. For the first time since I moved in, I wasn't a guest. I was a co-owner. That evening, Jessica didn't speak much at dinner. The marble countertop she once admired so proudly now seemed colder somehow. I caught her glancing around the kitchen, as if seeing it through new eyes. Not as her domain. Not entirely. Shared spaces feel different when control is shared. She couldn't casually suggest I downsize my belongings anymore. She couldn't subtly imply that I was temporary. My presence had legal roots now. Daniel tried to maintain normal conversation. He asked about my day. He commented on the weather. But beneath his calm tone was discomfort. I don't think he resented me. I think he resented the reality that he had underestimated me. It is humbling for a grown son to realize his mother understands contracts better than he does. The repayment agreement was structured carefully. The difference between the Mustang's insured value and the undervalued sale would be paid back monthly, formally documented, with interest. It wasn't an amount that would bankrupt them overnight, but it was enough to remind them, consistently, of what accountability feels like. Every payment would carry memory. 3 days later, the real shift revealed itself. Jessica's Range Rover lease renewal paperwork arrived. I watched from the living room as she opened the envelope, scanning the terms. Lease extensions require strong financial standing, stable income, clean credit history. And while no lawsuit had been filed, the late payment from the previous month had already registered. Their debt-to-income ratio had tightened due to the repayment structure. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was inconvenient. Jessica brought the paperwork to Daniel that night, her voice tight. They're increasing the monthly rate. Daniel rubbed his face slowly. We'll adjust. Adjust. It's an uncomfortable word when you're used to expansion. For weeks, I observed small changes. Fewer shopping deliveries. Fewer dinner reservations. Jessica scrolling through budgeting apps late at night. Her Pilates membership quietly paused. She didn't announce it. I just noticed. One afternoon, as I was watering the small plants by the front porch, Jessica came outside. She stood beside me, watching the neighborhood quietly. You planned all this, she said, not accusing, just stating. I prepared. I corrected gently. She folded her arms. You could have destroyed us. Yes, I agreed. But I didn't. Silence stretched between us. I didn't think, she began then stopped. You didn't think I was capable. I finished for her. She didn't deny it. That honesty, at least, was something. I thought you were emotional about the car, she admitted quietly. I didn't realize you were strategic. I looked at her calmly. Grief and intelligence are not opposites. That sentence lingered with her. Weeks passed, and something unexpected began to happen. Daniel started consulting me before making financial decisions. Not out of fear. Out of caution. He asked about refinancing options, investment restructuring, even retirement planning. The dynamic had shifted from parent-child to something more balanced, almost advisory. Jessica remained distant at first, but even she began softening in small ways. She stopped calling me Mary. One evening, without thinking, she said, Mom, do you want tea? The word slipped out naturally. She looked surprised when she realized it. I didn't comment. Respect grows slowly. But power, once revealed, never fully hides again. The Range Rover remained in the driveway, but it no longer gleamed with pride. It looked like what it truly was, a financed asset with conditions. A symbol of lifestyle rather than stability. And Jessica knew now that lifestyle without foundation is fragile. One evening, Daniel sat beside me on the back patio as the sun dipped low. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Not rushed. Not pressured. Genuine. For what? I asked. For thinking you needed us more than we needed you. I nodded slowly. That's the mistake many people make about aging, I replied. They confuse quiet with weakness. He absorbed that carefully. Inside, I could hear Jessica moving around the kitchen, slower than before, more thoughtful. Not defeated, just aware. Balance had been restored. But karma isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about education. And Jessica was just beginning to understand that actions don't disappear once the money is spent. They echo. And the echo of that Mustang? It wasn't finished yet. Because next month, the buyer who purchased it was going to receive a very interesting phone call. And that call was mine. People think closure comes from letting go. They're wrong. Sometimes closure comes from reclaiming what was taken. I had been thinking about that Mustang for weeks. Not obsessing. I'm too disciplined for that. But considering it carefully. The buyer's information had been included in the documentation Thomas requested. A private collector 2 states away. Paid quickly. No independent appraisal requested. That detail alone told me something important. He knew it was undervalued. And I don't blame him for that. A smart buyer takes advantage of opportunity. But what he didn't know was that the opportunity had been built on fraud. One quiet Tuesday morning, after Daniel left for work and Jessica drove off in her Range Rover, I made the call. The buyer answered on the 3rd ring. Confident voice. Polished. The kind of man who has bought and sold enough classic cars to recognize both beauty and desperation. I introduced myself calmly. My name is Mary Collins. I'm calling about the 1967 Mustang Fastback you recently purchased. There was a pause. Not defensive, cautious. Yes, ma'am. I'm the legal owner listed on the original title. Silence changed tone. He cleared his throat slightly. The sale was completed with proper documentation. I'm aware of the documentation, I replied evenly. Unfortunately, the authorization signature was forged. That landed hard. He didn't speak for several seconds. When he did, his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. Are you alleging fraud? I'm informing you that legal recovery is an option currently available to me, I said. However, I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling to discuss resolution. Now he was listening. The thing about businessmen is this. They respect clarity. Emotion makes them defensive. Precision makes them negotiate. I understand you paid $85,000, I continued calmly. The insured and appraised value was significantly higher. You likely recognized that. Another pause. Then surprisingly he sighed. I suspected the seller needed fast liquidity, he admitted. I didn't ask questions. I don't fault you for that, I replied. But I do intend to recover what was improperly transferred. He shifted his tone again. More cooperative now. What are you proposing? I want the vehicle back, I said simply. Straightforward. Clear. Uncomplicated. That startled him. You're willing to refund the purchase price? He asked carefully. Yes. With compensation? Yes. Silence stretched, but not tense, thoughtful. You understand I've already invested in transport and minor restoration work. I understand, I replied. And I'm prepared to compensate for documented expenses. There it was. Negotiation without chaos. After 20 minutes of structured discussion, we reached a preliminary agreement. I would wire the original purchase amount plus verified costs. In return, he would voluntarily reverse the transfer before any legal escalation. It would not be cheap. But I did not care. Money was never the heart of this. The Mustang was. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. This wasn't about possession alone. It was about restoring what had been disrespected. Daniel and Jessica came home that evening unaware that the foundation beneath their assumptions had shifted again. At dinner, Jessica mentioned the dealership had called about her lease adjustment. The new monthly rate was higher than she liked. She suggested maybe downsizing to something more practical next year. Practical. That word almost made me smile. Halfway through the meal, I placed my napkin down gently. I spoke to the Mustang's buyer today, I said calmly. Both of them froze. You what? Daniel asked. I'm reacquiring it. Jessica stared at me like I had just announced I was buying a spaceship. You're spending that kind of money? She asked, disbelief creeping in. I'm correcting a mistake, he replied. Daniel looked overwhelmed. Mom, why? After everything? Isn't it better to move on? I met his eyes steadily. Your father asked me to protect that car, I said softly. I failed once. I won't fail twice. The room fell silent. Jessica shifted in her chair. Where would you even keep it? That question carried more weight than she intended. I looked at her evenly. In my garage. Not the house garage. Meaning. Because 2 days earlier, I had quietly made another decision. I had begun the purchase process on a small property 15 minutes away. A modest place. 1 story. Large detached garage. Fully paid in cash. I hadn't told them yet. Not because I wanted to shock them, but because I wanted them to understand something deeply. I was never trapped here. I chose to stay. And choices can change. Daniel's voice trembled slightly. Are you moving out? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the silence work. Because sometimes the greatest realization isn't spoken. It's felt. And as Jessica glanced around the kitchen, the marble, the appliances, the carefully curated life, I could see it dawning on her. If I left, so did the financial stability. So did the leverage. So did the quiet backbone holding everything steady. The Mustang was coming home. But maybe I wasn't staying. And they were only just beginning to understand what that meant. The night I told them I might move out was the first time I saw real fear in my son's eyes. Not financial anxiety. Not stress over payments. Fear of loss. And there is a difference. Money can be replaced. Credit scores can be repaired. But once someone chooses to walk away from you, especially someone who held your life together quietly, that kind of damage is harder to undo. Daniel barely slept that night. I know because I heard him pacing long after midnight. Jessica, for once, was quiet. No frustrated whispers. No defensive explanations. Just silence. Heavy silence. The next morning, Daniel knocked on my door before leaving for work. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not exhausted from deadlines, but from reflection. "Mom," he said softly, "are you really planning to leave?" I folded the sweater I had been placing into a box, not packing in secret, just organizing, and looked at him carefully. "I'm planning to live somewhere I'm respected," I replied calmly. That answer hit him harder than anger ever could. He stepped into the room slowly. "I messed up. I thought. I don't know what I thought. That you'd always be here. That we'd always be fine." "That's the danger of assumption," I said gently. "You stop protecting what feels permanent." His eyes welled slightly, and for a moment, I didn't see the grown man with a mortgage and career pressures. I saw the little boy who used to beg his father for one more ride around the block in that Mustang. Jessica approached me differently. Later that afternoon, she asked if we could talk. Not at the kitchen island. Not standing defensively. She sat across from me in the living room. Hands folded, posture unsure. "I misjudged you," she admitted quietly. "That was new. You didn't think I'd push back," I said evenly. "No," she answered honestly. "I didn't think you'd have the strength." Strength. It's funny how people measure that word. Loudness. Youth. Physical energy. They forget that strength can look like stillness. Like restraint. Like knowing exactly when to act. "You thought I was sentimental," I continued. "Emotional. Dependent." She nodded slightly. "And now?" I asked. "Now I realize you were patient." There it was. The truth. Patience is dangerous when it belongs to someone intelligent. Jessica's voice softened. "If you leave, everything changes." "Yes," I said. "It does." And she knew I wasn't talking about money. Without my structured financial contribution and oversight, their budget would stretch thin. Without my co-ownership stability, refinancing options would tighten. Without my presence, the emotional balance of the home would shift again. But deeper than that, she was beginning to understand something more uncomfortable. They had almost lost me permanently over arrogance. 2 days later, the Mustang arrived. The transport truck pulled into the driveway just after noon. I stepped outside before either of them could react. When the carrier lowered the ramp and that midnight blue fastback rolled slowly into sunlight, my chest tightened in a way that felt almost sacred. The paint still shimmered. The chrome still caught the light. The engine, when it turned over, sounded exactly like Robert's laughter, deep and familiar. Daniel stood beside me, speechless. Jessica watched quietly from the porch. I ran my hand along the hood, remembering hospital rooms and whispered promises. This time, I had kept my word. Daniel cleared his throat. "Are you taking it to the new place?" I looked at him slowly. "Yes," I said. The word settled heavily between us. Jessica stepped forward unexpectedly. "You don't have to go," she said, voice steadier than before. "We were wrong. I was wrong." Apologies are easy when consequences are near. But this one felt different. Not desperate. Honest. "I'm not leaving because I'm angry," I explained calmly. "I'm leaving because I need independence. And so do you." Daniel's face tightened. "This is our fault." "It's a lesson," I corrected. That evening, we sat together in the living room, not arguing, not negotiating, just sitting. The kind of silence families have when something major has shifted and everyone feels it. Jessica finally spoke. "Will you still come for dinner?" I smiled faintly. "If I'm invited." "You'll always be invited," Daniel said quickly. I believed him. Because they finally understood. Respect isn't automatic just because someone ages. Love doesn't excuse betrayal. And power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes, it looks like walking away before you're pushed. As I stood in the doorway that night, looking at the house one more time, I realized something important. They had thought they were teaching me how the modern world worked. But in the end, I taught them how accountability works. And tomorrow morning, I would drive that Mustang into my own garage. Alone. But not lonely. The morning I drove the Mustang to my new home, the sky was clear in a way that felt intentional. Crisp blue, early sunlight stretching across the road like possibility. When I turned the key and the engine came alive, that familiar rumble filled the air. And for the first time since Robert passed, the sound didn't hurt. It steadied me. I eased out of the driveway slowly. Daniel and Jessica stood on the porch watching. Not angry. Not defensive. Just quiet. The same driveway where that car once disappeared without my consent was now the place it left with my permission. That difference mattered. The drive to my new house wasn't long, but it felt symbolic. Every mile was distance from dependence. From assumption. From being underestimated. The small property I purchased wasn't extravagant. It didn't have marble countertops or designer lighting. But it had something far more valuable. It had my name on every document. Fully paid. No leverage attached. When I pulled into the detached garage and shut off the engine, silence settled around me. I sat there for a moment with my hands still on the steering wheel, remembering Robert's last request. Protect it. Protect what we built. Protect yourself. This time, I had done all three. Moving out wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors or final speeches. Daniel helped carry boxes. Jessica packed dishes carefully. The tension that once filled that house had softened into something quieter. Reflection, maybe even humility. They weren't losing me. They were losing control over a narrative they once believed. A week later, they came over for dinner. Not out of obligation. Out of effort. Jessica brought flowers. Not expensive ones, thoughtful ones. Daniel insisted on grilling, just like his father used to. And when he stood in my garage staring at the Mustang, his expression wasn't guilt anymore. It was understanding. "I get it now," he said quietly. "Get what?" I asked. That it wasn't about the car. He was right. It never was. It was about respect. About assuming someone's age equals weakness. About believing that because someone is quiet, they are unaware. About thinking love excuses entitlement. Jessica surprised me later that evening. "I used to think security meant having the nicest things," she admitted as we sat at my small kitchen table. "Now I think it means knowing you can stand on your own." Growth rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in sentences like that. The repayment agreement continued, just as planned. Every month, the transfer arrived. Not because I needed it desperately, but because honoring an agreement builds character. I invested those payments, quietly. Maybe one day I'll give it back to them. Maybe I won't. That decision is mine. The Range Rover? They downsized. Not because I forced them to. Because they finally understood lifestyle without foundation is fragile. They chose stability over image. Responsibility over pride. And that was the real karma. Not destruction. Correction. One evening, months later, Daniel asked if he could take the Mustang for a short drive. Just around the block. I watched him grip the steering wheel the same way Robert once had. Careful, reverent. When he returned, his eyes were misty. I'm sorry, he said again. This time, I believed the lesson had rooted. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It simply decides not to carry it forward. I forgave them. But I didn't forget the strength it took to reclaim myself. Aging is a strange thing in this country. People celebrate youth like it's the only currency that matters. They look at gray hair and assume decline. They see wrinkles and assume fragility. What they don't see is the decades of experience layered beneath that skin. The contracts signed. The losses survived. The instincts sharpened. They thought I was just a grandmother living in their guest room. What they didn't understand was this. I was the woman who survived every chapter before them. And I would survive every chapter after. The Mustang sits in my garage now, polished every Sunday morning. Sometimes Daniel joins me. Sometimes he doesn't. But when I wipe down the hood and see my reflection in that midnight blue shine, I don't see betrayal anymore. I see resilience. They sold the last thing my husband left me, and in trying to take it, they reminded me of something powerful. Never underestimate a woman who has already buried her greatest love. Because once you've survived that kind of loss, you stop being afraid of anything else. And that's the kind of strength no one can sell. If you like this story of mine, please like, comment, and subscribe my channel.